Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Gaming and the 319 Lake of Calandra guide for the Lightning Strike Raider. Now, I'll be honest, I was secretly hoping this build would get gutted so I could get away with not bringing yet another guide out, but here we are. So before we jump into the meat and bones of the guide, I want to give a quick overview of the build, strengths and weaknesses, just so you can get an understanding of whether this build might be for you, because if after the first 5 minutes you think, no, it's not for me, then it saves you the time of looking through the guide. So I've linked some build diary videos from last league. But on day 3 or 4, I had all the void stones and most of the invitations completed. And by day 6, I was farming Juiced Altar T16 Delirium maps. Now, if you're keen to know how the build performs on certain gear, I'd recommend checking each of those videos out. Now, all of this was without an influence chest. There was no determination, no bottled faith, and no crystallized omniscience. Now, other than the nerf to Defiance banner and the slight nerf to mana reservation, it's pretty much as it was last league. But essentially, because Defiance ban has been nerfed, yes, it's still good, but just dropping that means we don't have to worry about the nerf to the mana reservation. So let's talk about the build. So it's a raider, so it's naturally super quick to map, and this is really what the build is built for. However, it is a really good all-rounder and can comfortably boss and do invitations within the first week of the league on a fairly reasonable budget. Now, to me, the build is super fun. I've played it as my league starter for the last 4 or 5 leagues. Not sure whether I'm playing it this league just because I might have reached my limit of how many times I can do it, but I did say that last league and I ended up league starting with it anyway. Now the build does take some ramping up, so if you want a build that's purely to boss and get all your 4 void stones on next to no budget like something like Seismic Trap, then the build's not for you. But if you want an all-rounder that's decently tanky and really focuses mainly on speed mapping, then this could be a build that you'll really enjoy. Now, there's a separate video that I've already brought out covering how to level and actually get the character up to sort of T14 viability. So this guide is just going to focus on the mechanics of the build, specifics on gear and links, and is mainly going to be looking at your end game gear goal for week 1. Not going to go into really end game gear because we don't know what the crafting mechanic is. So what I'd like to do is bring a guide out like this, which shows you what to aim for the first week. And then once we get settled into where there's a new crafting mechanic, what the new league mechanic does, are there any good new uniques, then I'll bring out another guide showing like, not min-max because I don't min-max characters, but to a point where you can clear most of the content really comfortably. Now at its heart, it is a melee build, but as a lot of the clear and damage comes from projectiles, I'd really call it more of a hybrid projectile melee build. Now the main thing that frustrates people about Vaal Lightning Strike is that projectiles go along the ground. So any scenery that comes from the ground is going to block your projectiles, including the tiniest little pebbles that you'd find on a beach. So before we jump into the build and gear, I just want to talk through how to actually play the build and point out some really important mechanics and interactions. Now, if you've played Vaal Lightning Strike before, feel free to skip this bit as I'm probably teaching you how to suck eggs. So the first thing to note is that, as many of you are aware, this skill double hits if you position correctly, and you've got +1 additional strike from somewhere either on your gear or in a gem. And then to do that, you just stand slightly away from the boss or your enemy, and what happens is you'll strike the boss, and then at the same time, the +1 strike will also hit the boss. It summons like a clone of you, like Ancestral Call, and you'll both hit the boss. Because of this, it means you can hit your enemy with both the projectiles and the melee, so essentially double dipping. Now this is important to get used to, as you are really gimping your boss DPS if you don't do it. Now, the second thing to note is the build stacks Nightblade and Elusive effect, which we were all expecting to get gutted in this league, but somehow it survived. The way it works is when you crit, you get an Elusive buff, and it slowly ticks down to 0, and it can't be reapplied by the same skill. What you can do, however, is run Withering Step on your left click, because that will then do its own Elusive buff that resets your Nightblade buff. This means that between packs and between kiting around an enemy, you're going to get your full Nightblade buff back really regularly. So you're going to probably fluctuate from somewhere between 75 to 90% Nightblade buff nearly all of the time. Now on bosses, this means repositioning realistically every 3 to 4 seconds to make sure you're keeping your DPS up. There's nothing you need to do to get this to work because you've got Withering Step on left click. It's just a mechanic you can totally forget about and you're good to go. Also, thing to mention is on bosses, there are some steps you need to take in order to maximize your damage. On map bosses, once you're geared, it doesn't matter. They'll melt in literally seconds. But when you're taking on a big boss and you want to maximize DPS, you need to make sure you've got your 2 Vaal Lightning Strikes available when you want to burst damage. And what you're going to do is you're going to drop your Ancestral Totem, pop all your flasks, hit your 2 Vile Lightning Strikes, and then attack the boss with normal Lightning Strike. And that's going to give you the best burst damage all in one go. And then the last thing to mention is Shock Effect is absolutely huge for this build. We use a lightning skill, we use added lightning gem, so we can get an absolute ton of lightning damage. Now with taking some right passives and some gear, you can easily get 50% chance of shock on bosses, and that is a huge DPS increase. Now we're going to cover how to do that later on when we go over the tree and the gear. Now that covers most intricacies of the build that come to mind, so let's move on to the nitty gritty. So we'll just firstly get Pantheons and Bandits out of the way. As with most builds, we're killing all Bandits to get 2 skill points. Crit Multi doesn't do a lot because you've got about 800% anyway, and we don't need the mana regen or resistances. For Pantheons, I think it really depends on what you want out of the build, but I like to go for Lunaris for Major. You get a movement speed and fizz reduction when you're mapping. It's really, really nice. You get a chance to avoid projectiles, which is also handy. You can also avoid change projectiles, but really the only thing projectiles are going to chain off is our totem, which is only up at bosses, so it doesn't do that much, but it's a nice safety layer. For Minor Pantheon, these really, I get asked this all the time. What's the Minor Pantheon for the build? And there isn't one. The Minor Pantheon really depends on what type of content you're running. So I always farm Exarch Influence maps because for whatever reason, I don't like running E2 Worlds maps. So I'm always going to take Abberath Burning Ground because you literally need it if you're running those maps. But feel free to change this. If you're not running that content, you may not need Burning Ground. Now, I may recommend Burning Ground anyway because there's a few Arch Nemesis monsters and normal monsters that leave Burning Ground, and it does actually do a lot of damage because you don't have any life regen in the build. But Minor Pantheon is really totally up to you. So we'll move on to Ascendancy Order. This is what I would recommend. Feel free to change it, but I like to go Quartz Infusion first. You get phasing and you get a good chunk of spell suppression. And with the buffs in 3.19, it actually means with spell suppress capped by the end of Act 4, which is absolutely awesome. Just makes the campaign feel a lot safer. Next point, we're taking Avatar of the Veil. We get a good chunk of ailment avoidance, but more importantly, we get 20% exposure, which is a massive DPS boost. We can always use Blood Rave for charges to make up the fact that we haven't taken the Frenzy Charge nodes. And they're the ones we're going to take next. Third lab, we're going to take Where the Poacher for Frenzy Charges. Then Uber Lab, you're going to finalize the build by getting Avatar of Slaughter. This gives you increased evasion, movement speed, and attack speed per Frenzy Charge. And we're taking all the nodes on the tree, plus 1 from the Ascendancy, which is going to be a minimum of 7 Frenzy Charges. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the gem links. Now, none of these have to be slotted in a specific item other than obviously your 6 link in your chest. So let's move on to what you want to run for each slot. So let's start with the main 6 link in your chest. You obviously need a Vile Lightning Strike gem, and 20/20 is preferable, but they can be expensive. So I recommend just running a 20 without any quality. Level up some Lightning Strike gems in your offhand, fill all 6 slots with these gems. Get them to 20/20 and then corrupt them in Doriani's Institution in the Alva Temples to try and double corrupt one to 21/20 Vile Lightning Strike. Now, Vile Lightning Strike gems can either be found in Vile side areas or by just using a Vile Orb on a normal Lightning Strike gem, or you can buy them from trade. So the first support gem we're going to look at is Nightblade Support, and this is what gives us the elusive buff when we crit. This is shown by the visual, which also shows you what percentage your elusive is. The next support gem is Trinity Support. This gem gives us a boost to elemental damage and elemental penetration when we've got 2 types of damage that overlap each other. Now, one common misconception, because it's called Trinity, is that you need to overlap all 3. You don't, it's just 2. So for example, if your skill did 8 to 100 lightning damage and 40 to 45 cold damage, you're going to constantly proc Trinity as your high roll for cold and high roll for lightning keep rolling over each other. The symbol here is what represents Trinity, and as you can see in this screenshot, all 3 sections are filled out, which means I've got Trinity. If only 2 sections are filled out and 1 is empty, it means you're hitting with just 1 damage type as a high roll, and you're going to need to balance your stats. The next support gem is Added Lightning. The reason I recommend this over Added Cold is for 2 reasons. Firstly, it makes it easier to get max shock effect on enemies. Also, we're going to want to replace it with Awakened later on. Secondly, it makes it much easier to proc Trinity, as lightning damage has a massive range from low to high compared to cold and fire. And at endgame, there's 2 items that you might be running, which are Blizzard Crown and Mark of the Elder, which both have added cold on them. So if you then also run an added cold gem, you might not be able to proc Trinity because your cold damage is too high. Next, we're going to be using LE damage with attacks, and when you can afford it, you want the Awakened version. At level 5, this makes you immune to Elemental Reflect from this skill. And then finally, we're going to be using Inspiration. This gives us reduced mana cost, it gives us elemental damage, and it gives us crit chance. Now, if you like to push builds and really min-max them, you're likely to drop this gem later on, as you're probably not going to benefit from the crit, so there's going to be other gems that would be more beneficial. But for the majority of builds, this is a good gem to use. Now, if you're running this build before you get plus strike gloves, you're going to need to replace either LE damage or inspiration with Ancestral Call. Now, one gem to talk about is multi-strike, as a lot of people on PoE Ninja use it. My recommendation would be, if you're doing a boss fight that's not part of a map and it's an individual encounter like Cirrus, Ubereld or something like that, multi-strike is a really good gem to use to boost your single target. So I would recommend maybe swapping it out for inspiration. However, when you're mapping, I don't think it's a good gem. The stats on PoB assume you get all 3 hits off every time, and it assumes perfect uptime. And this is where all the extra damage from multi-strike comes from, is the additional strikes that you do. And you have to stand still to get all these off. When you're geared up and mapping, you are going to kill enemies with 1 hit. So you're going to hit, cancel the rest, hit, cancel the rest. So you don't benefit from any of the extra damage. And it doesn't support the Vaal skill. So you lose quite a bit of damage from clear speed because your Vaal Lightning Strike has 1 less support gem. Personally, I also think it feels super janky to map with and just absolutely hate it, but it is totally up to you. You can run this gem, just see how it feels with the different combinations. So we're going to move on to the auras next. They're really, really simple. Until you pick up Mana Reservation on gear, you're running Determination for survivability, Precision for accuracy and crit chance, and then Anger for DPS. Now, we get asked a lot, why not Wrath? There's a few reasons. Firstly, we don't want to super overload on lightning damage to the point where Trinity becomes an issue. Secondly, Wrath at level 21 has an int requirement of 159, so it can make gearing a bit more awkward. And lastly, the Watcher's Eye options for Anger are better, although both are trumped by Precision. As I said, if you want to add Defiance Banner in, you're going to need to find Mana Reservation on gear, otherwise you're not going to have enough mana for stuff like your Mark or your defense skill, or even your skill. For movement skill, we're going to be running Whirling Blades linked to faster attacks. We then need an unlinked Flame Dash for gaps and those annoying vines. And then you need an unlinked Withering Step to keep up your elusive buff, and you're going to assign this to your left move button. Now, when you're super juiced, it is possible to die to Reflect from Whirling Blades. So if you have a spare socket later on, let's say you're doing 20 million DPS, your Whirling Blades might kill you from Reflect. One option to stop this is to slot a level 1 Brutality into the link so that you can't do any elemental damage. So we're going to move on to Guard skill. Now, because in this iteration of the build we're going to use Determination, it makes sense to run Molten Shell. But you don't want it to be the Vaal version because all Vaal skills share souls, and we want Vaal Lightning Strike to be up as much as possible. Early on, I normally run a level 11 Molten Shell and a level 2 Cast and Damage Taken, but the levels are up to you. I would also recommend linking an increased duration gem to the skill. So for curse skills, we're going to be using Assassin's Mark for extra crit, and it synergizes well with the Mark and Coal nodes, and they're a really good option at endgame. Going to be using Mark on hit to trigger this automatically on rare and unique enemies. I would also recommend linking either Life Tap or Inspiration to this because it is a very mana costly skill. Personally, if you can, I'd just use Inspiration to lower the cost rather than use Life to cast it. However, we have so much life gain on hit and leech that you're not even going to notice your life going down from Life Tap. Now, your totem setup ideally wants to be Ancestral Protector linked with Multi-Totem. So the reason for Multi-Totem is if you just have one, that totem might die. If you've got multi-totems, there's more chance that one totem survives. It also taunts enemies quite well in content even with no links, so it can be a really, really good safety mechanic. Now, if you haven't yet reached the culling nodes on the tree, you can put Culling Strike in this for bosses. And that's it for the gems, so let's move on to the gear. Now, just want to reiterate again, this guide's looking at realistic gear to have by the end of week 1 if you play a reasonable amount, and then we're going to go into another gear set that's beyond that. This is going to be enough damage to clear the majority of content in the game. I'm not going to really cover min-max into like 50 million DPS because I don't push builds that far. But if you're interested, join our Discord or check out PoE Ninja because tons of people push this build to the max. If you want to know how to level in Axe and early maps, check out the separate leveling guide as it covers it in a massive amount of detail. So let's move on to the gear. So what we're going to do for the gear in a moment is open up Path of Building, because I've got 2 sets of gear in there that I think represent end of week 1 gear that someone could have if they play quite a lot. And then another gear set that goes even further from that you might have after week 2 or 3. Now, if you're playing absolute ton, there's no reason you can't just aim for the more expensive gear set. But I want to give people sort of gaps that they can bridge to get from gear set to increase their damage. So these are what you want to aim for once you're comfortably farming T4T maps on the budget setup. Save up for this particular setup. So we'll open up Path of Building. There's going to be a tree for each one because one will utilize cluster jewels. And I'll talk through the gear, what attributes you want to find on it, and how you can craft this gear where it's applicable. So apologies if there's some background noise. It's absolutely roasting at the moment, so I've had to have my fan running because I'm going to melt if I don't. Might as well run through the tree and the gear at the same time. So I've got 2 trees set up depending on what gear you're going to be using, because some nodes aren't needed once you push into higher end gear. So we'll start with the normal tree, which I would recommend. This would be level 93. Just going to go through the jewels, the masteries, not the tree in general, because it's a fairly bog standard tree for this sort of build. But we fit a Lethal Pride in here. Now, obviously with the changes that are coming up to Divines, these are going to be expensive to roll. Now, the good thing about Lethal Prides is even if we're not going for damage nodes, there's loads of useful options. And you can slot it here, here, or if you get decent nodes, it can even work there. So if you buy a jewel, just buy the cheapest one you can get, check in all 3 slots. You're looking for either Fizz Teganist Fire, extra life, extra strength, melee crit chance and crit multi aren't the worst. Your big ones are double damage and intimidate on hit, but they might be quite expensive. Overall though, this item as a whole helps us out because it gives us a lot of strength that we don't have to find on gear. If they're really expensive or there's no options available, then you can just leave this out and just get some strength on some gear to make up for it. So we'll go through the masteries. Now this is early game before you've got a lot of chaos resistance on your gear. Chaos damage is quite juicy now at the moment, so I would always recommend picking up these nodes and then getting Corrupted Blood on here until we can get it on a jewel. We're obviously taking the Nightblade Mastery in the claws, and we're taking this Dagger Wheel and taking the other elusive mastery. Because we don't have any leech on this mastery, we're then going to take these 2 nodes here and also take increased damage while leeching. Come further down, we're going to take increased crit chance based on spell suppression, and just from the tree with the new numbers, you're going to have 100%. In your crit wheel, you're going to take increased effect of non-damaging ailments because it puts more chill on enemies, and more importantly, it puts more shock on enemies, which does more damage. Here, you're going to have to take Precision Reservation Mastery to make sure your mana's nice and comfy. These nodes will probably drop later on, these early nodes, but again, increased effect of non-damaging ailments, really important. This one I would say is optional. It's just an increased effect of mark, so it's only going to count on elite and bosses. Again, this one as well is optional. It adds 5.5% DPS, so it's quite nice. But this is one of the last things I would add in. And then the last one is Determination Reservation Mastery, which you're going to need to fit all your auras in. So let's go into the basic. I say basic, it's not going to be cheap, but this is kind of the gear that I would aim for at the end of week 1. For a claw, you're basically looking for T1 to T2 lightning damage, so like Deafening Essence of Wrath would be the best way to get it. You're then looking for a mid-tier cold or fire, high attack speed, tier 2 minimum, and then you're going to craft Ellie Pen. You really want crit on your claw, but early on these might be like 10x for one with crit chance on it. So it's not really necessary. It's not a huge amount to DPS. It's going to be included in a later gear set, but for now you're just looking for lightning damage, high roll, a mid to high roll of another element, and some decent attack speed. That's it. For your shield, you're looking for life, chaos res, and avoid ailments. Avoid ailments is really easy to roll, especially now harvest is basically do whatever craft you want. All you do is you roll the fire, lightning, or cold seeds in harvest, and ailment rolls all the time. You just need to make sure it's item level 73 or above to hit that tier 1 roll for elemental ailments. For your helmet, you're looking to get a helmet with plus 3 additional targets pierced for lightning strike. 2 is also an option if 3 are really expensive. End game, it's going to be a Blizzard Crown, which will go on in a minute. But these are always consistently like 6 to 10x or divines, whatever the currency is going to be. And they very rarely change because everyone who runs lightning strike is looking for one. So what I would recommend if you end up farming Eldritch currencies is you roll reduced mana cost of attacks and increase attack damage. It bridges the gap slightly between the damage that you get from the Blizzard Crown, and reduced mana cost is really helpful. So to roll this helmet, you're going to use Deafening or Shrieking Essences of Loathing because that rolls mana reservation efficiency, which is highlighted in green. All you're looking for is to roll a nice life roll and some resistances, or resistances and an empty prefix, because you can craft quite high life on a helmet. That's going to mean you can then slot Defiance Banner whenever you want to add it in. For your body armor, you're looking for a Hunter Influence 6-link item, and you're going to roll this with crit or attack in Harvest, and it's going to guarantee the attacks have chance to critical strike. And there's 2 different brackets for this. There's 0.5 to 1 and 1 to 1.5. You obviously want the tier 1 roll. You just roll in this until you get a decent chest that you like the look of. So you can either buy a 6-link Hunter item, or you can buy a normal 6-link item and then slam it with a Hunter Exalt to then get the influence that you need on the item. For your gloves, as I say, before you transition into the full 6-link, you need skills target 1 additional nearby enemy. I would just keep an eye on trade to see what these cost against what they're going to cost to roll. To get this mod, you literally just roll the Syrian Exarch Embers on item level 75 or above gloves until you hit it. Your second roll at some point wants to be pierced, but it's not mandatory, so anything else that benefits the build you can put on there. The good thing about using this is once you've got those implicits, you're then free to craft the gloves however you want, to fit in whatever stats you need. So get some life, obviously, you can get attack speed, any resistances you like, you can get accuracy, you could get dex, you could get strength. Any attributes or any stuff that you want, you can aim to target craft these gloves, and it's probably just simply doing it with essences. For boots, we've just got a pair of 2-tone boots to help with resistances. We don't need spell suppression, so these are really easy. It's just life, movement speed, and preferably some chaos resistance if you can get it. For your amulet, your anointment's going to be Divine Judgment. It's really cheap. I'd recommend it all the time since it's a huge boost to DPS. I would try and get all attributes on this amulet because it's going to make the rest of your gearing a bit easier. Then you're just looking for LE damage to attacks, crit strike, crit multi, attack speed, anything that adds damage. I would not waste your amulet slot on resistances because we can get so much DPS out of one rare amulet. And then whatever your empty prefix or suffix is, just craft something that's going to benefit the build. Now for your rings, I would really recommend going for Amethyst rings. If you run 2 that have the 23% implicit, that's 46% to chaos resistance. What I like to do with rings is roll the essences that apply LE damage to attack. So you can get lightning, cold, and fire essences. That automatically guarantees your rings are going to get some damage. They're normally the cheapest essences. Last league, deafening ones were 1 chaos in bulk. So you could literally buy 50 of these and roll them on these rings until you get some really juicy stats. So again, you're just looking for resistances, life, and some damage. Now, I just want to quickly touch on the league mechanic because the league mechanic allows you to craft jewelry that has upsides and downsides. So if we take this ring as an example, there's some things that really don't matter. Like +2 life gain for each enemy hit does not matter. We're getting like 40 or 50 anyway. Cast speed obviously doesn't matter. 27 mana is not going to break the bank. But things like lightning damage to attacks, all LE res and life are big for us. So this is a perfect ring that you could put in that mirror and try and get a decent copy of it where it might flip the stats of the stuff you don't want and give you boosts to the ones that you do. That's all you want to look at when you're looking at the league mechanic is don't put anything in that's all good stats because you're going to have to pick minus on one and plus on another. So I would also never put your current items in there because they might brick and then you're going to go and have to search for another item. But for this build, there's quite a few things like mana regen we don't need, life regen we don't need, anything to do with casting we don't need. There's loads of things that we do not need on this build. So you could end up getting an amazing ring on this and amulet. So they're definitely options if you wanted to boost the build further and have some fun trying out the new league mechanic. For the belt, you're looking for a Stygian Vise. At end game, heavy belt before this is fine because it helps with strength. Again, you're just looking for life and resistances. So I would roll this with any of the essences that grant guaranteed resistances. Probably the Chaos one would be best because this is the hardest resistance to get into the build. They're also really, really pricey early on. So if you end up getting a good roll, you've even got the option of selling it for a decent amount. And then in there, you just want a Murderous Sigil that's going to give some stats that benefit you. So this one's life, accuracy, fire damage. If you needed things like, resistances or crit chance, you can put those on there as well. Anything with life and additional stats is going to be absolutely fine. Now for your flask, you run in a Quicksilver, Granite, Diamond, and Jade. On these, you want increased evasion, definitely on one of them. Increased armor is a definite on one of them. And then I'd recommend increased crit and increased attack speed. But it's up to you. You could go movement speed, you could go less curse effect. There's loads of options. And then just a Corrupted Blood instant life flask. Now, yes, we're going to get Corrupted Blood immune, but we're not going to be immune to actual bleeding. So it's just there as, a safety net if you do get a heavy bleed on you. I've touched on the Lethal Pride jewel. In terms of filling in your other jewel slots, I find that normally the biggest boost to DPS is attack speed. So things like attack speed while holding a shield, increased crit chance, crit multi with Ellie is not too bad, but I have found attack speed is the best one. Again, you could use these jewel sockets to balance out your attributes or your resistances, your accuracy, whatever you like. So what we're going to do now is just touch on the second tree because there's going to be some changes that you're going to make as you progress up through your gear. And then we're going to go through the gear to go along with that. So I've called this one high budget. So what we've done is dropped Corrupted Blood and Chaos Resistance because we're going to pick all this up on gear. We've also dropped these Ellie nodes because the more damage you stack, the less effective these nodes are. We do lose the increased effective armament, which is a shame, but adding in a cluster jewel is the best way to take this build further. Now, you've got two chest options at this point. So if we go to the expensive gear, I would recommend a stacked normal chest and put some Exarch mods on it because you're going to be able to get massive life resistances off of your chest. The other option would be something like a double influenced chest here, which would be Hunter and Warlord. You want gain an endurance charge if you've been hit recently and attacks have critical strike chance. But the reason we're going cluster jewel setup is we can basically negate both of these by adding in cluster jewels. So if we go back to this item, so this is just a temple item that's dropped. You'd 6-link it yourself, craft the max life and mana, and then you'd roll for your implicits. I've gone determination for safety, but you could go anger for DPS. There's loads of good stuff on chest. You can get max resistances. There's lots of good stuff you can roll, which is why I maybe recommend not going an influence chest. It also should work out cheaper. So how are we getting by the crit that we're going to lose and the endurance charges? So what we're doing, we're dropping the leech nodes here and we're adding in a 3 passive attack cluster. Now these are quite easy to roll with attack in Harvest. So save up your life essence from Harvest and roll an 8 passive cluster. What you're looking for is Feed the Fury to get attack speed, damage while leeching, and some life leech. Martial Prowess is just amazing. It's damage, speed, accuracy, and damage with ailments, which doesn't really matter. And then Fuel the Fight. This takes care of your mana leech, which allows you to drop the nodes. And what we're going to do is link that up to a 4 passive ailment effect cluster. And we're going for Overshock and Storm Rider. So Overshock increases lightning ailment. So this is where we make up the mastery that we lost. You get increased lightning damage. More importantly is Storm Rider. This is the one you want. So if you end up rolling another passive with Storm Rider, I would just go with it. It gives us a chance to gain a power charge when you shock a chilled enemy. We always chill and we always shock. So you're going to get your power charges up. Once they're up, they're going to stay up. You also get increased cold against shocked enemies and lightning against chilled. So again, we get that damage. This means we can take a power charge node on the tree. That's plus 4 power charges. That pretty much makes up for the mod that we lost on the Hunter item. To get the endurance charges, we're just slotting in a 2 passive Enduring Composure cluster jewel. These are dirt cheap to buy, super easy to alt roll as well. And that takes care of the endurance charges. That's what I would recommend doing for the tree. You can just not do this cluster at all. Go with your double influence chest and maybe path up here to get some life and crit. It's totally up to you. So let's go through the gear that you're going to need to support this particular tree. So what we've done with our claw, same claw as before, but we've got crit chance on it. The shield I've not changed in the slightest. The helmet is where we go, and probably the biggest expense of the build is going to be a Blizzard Crown with Lightning Strike enchant. These are going to be multiple Divines, Exalts, whatever the currency ends up being, and you're rolling it exactly the same as you rolled your last one. Mana Reservation Essences until you get a helmet that you're happy with. As a body armor, I've gone for a Temple mod body armor with even more life crafted on. What you could do is you could do the new Gravicious craft, which gives you Fizz, Taken as Fire and Lightning. That might end up better in terms of increasing your max life pool. Gloves, we're the same as before, but we're adding an additional strike. So strike skills target 2 additional nearby enemies. There is a video which I'll link in the description which shows how to craft these gloves. If you already have a really amazing pair of gloves and you'd rather spend the money crafting the implicits on that, it shows you how to do it. Again, these gloves are very similar. I've just added some strength in. The boots, again, I've not changed at all. Ideally, you would actually probably roll over the two-tone implicit and you would get something like increased elusive effect and increased action speed to get more DPS. The amulet, I'm pretty sure I haven't changed this either, kept it exactly the same. You obviously really want to be looking for something better than this, so more damage, more life. Or you could go for something like a unique amulet. You could go for Yoke of Suffering to really push you shock up. It's totally up to you. And then for rings, we've gone to the Mark of the Elder Shaper combination to boost up the damage. So all I've done is just applied Shaper Influence to one of the rings you already had. Obviously, you couldn't do that. You need to buy the Shaper ring and craft it as you crafted the rings earlier. And then you got Mark of the Elder. And what this does, as says here, is increase attack damage if your other ring is a Shaper item. You're then going to catalyst that up with Elemental Catalyst. I think they're called Turbulent, because then that boosts all of the damage stats on the ring. Now, the one issue with this item is that it might be more expensive for a well-rolled one because Divine Orbs are likely to be really expensive. So don't scrimp on this, because at some point, if you buy the minimum attack damage and minimum life, you're going to want to upgrade it and you're going to have to spend the money at some point. And then the Stygian Vise, again, is just going to be Chaos Resistance and life. The main difference on this gear set, other than the Blizzard Crown and the chest, is start getting Chaos Resistance on more of your gear and get Corrupted Blood Immune on one of your jewels. Murderous Sigils are normally cheaper than normal jewels in terms of Corrupted Blood, so I would go for that. Flask will stay the same, but if you're swimming in money, you're more than welcome to add in a Bottled Faith, because that is massive on bosses. Watcher's Eye we've also added in, and I will go with attack damage while affected by precision. It's easily the biggest increase to DPS, but crit multi with anger is not too bad. And that kind of covers off the gear. This POB will be in the video description. There's not going to be any notes in it. It's just the gear sets and the final trees. And there'll be a POB in the leveling video that shows you step by step how to get to this point. So before I sign off, I just want to quickly talk about new uniques, because there's obviously been 100 reworked uniques. At this stage, I also don't know what the new uniques are. So when I bring out a more endgame version a week into the league, I'll include any of those that might be relevant. But in terms of the reworked uniques, for endgame, there's not really anything that we're going to be able to use to improve the build, but there's some really good leveling options if you find them, but I wouldn't buy them. New Prison Weave belt looks really good. Just that belt alone is going to carry your damage massively through the campaign. And the new Flame Chest looks brilliant. Like 40% fizz damage taken as fire with 100% spell suppression is going to make you so tanky in the campaign. But again, I don't see it fitting into the end game build, so don't go spending money on it. It's just going to be a nice quality of life for the campaign. Now, in terms of end game uniques, there's a few options to think about. So for DPS, an All's Uprising with free haste looks like a really good option this league, since haste got a really nice buff. We already map really quickly. This is just going to put it to insane levels of speed. For defensive options, something that's been used league after league is getting an All's Amulet with Anger Reservation. Then that turns into a free aura. You then add Grace in to boost your defenses up, and you're running Grace, Determination, and Defiance banner, the Holy Trinity. Yoke of Suffering is a nice option as an amulet. Gives really good resistances, lots of nice damage, and shock effect. However, at endgame, you're probably going to be hitting max shock anyway. You're going to be res capped, so the only thing you're really getting is the increased damage per almond, and I think there's better options at endgame as an amulet. Now, one option I want to talk about, which people often use, but I honestly think it's super outdated now, is Farrell's Fur combined with Dark Ray Vectors. Personally, I think this version is too hard to get a decent life pool, and get tanky enough on it. With powerful Eldritch mods now available on chest and boots, I just think there's much better ways to build it. Power charges are quite easy to get. I just feel the setup is outdated. However, it's your choice. Just don't come asking for advice on how to make your 3k life build more tanky. Now that pretty much covers the guide for the league. There's a written forum guide linked in the description, which should be fully updated by league start. There's links to leveling filters that I recommend. There's a link to our Discord, and there's a link to the leveling video, which I recommend watching if you've not played the skill. One thing I will say is that the new tree is not out in POB, so this is based on 3.18. So don't save this POB for your league start purposes. Come back on launch day, the guide will be updated with a new POB. Now I've not touched on min-maxing, as I briefly mentioned, because there's things we're going to discover in the league that might add to the build. It could be there's intricacies to the league mechanic that means you can craft stupidly powerful items deterministically. There might be a new unique that can really add a lot to the build. At the moment, there's still a few undiscovered things, but they're not going to affect you getting your Atlas done, getting Uber Elder done, getting Cirrus done, and that sort of thing. But it might be that it's a way to boost the build even further. So around 1 week into the league, I'll bring a guide out if there's any real significant updates to talk about. Now that wraps things up quite nicely. Well, I hope it does. I hope I've not forgotten anything. If I have, please ask in the comments. As always, thanks for watching. Hope you have a really enjoyable league start, and I'll see you in the Lake of Kalandra.